Hello and welcome back. I'm Ms. Patel, here to teach you about topic 3.6, contemporary causes of diffusion. So much like Mr. Hill talked about historical causes of diffusion, we're going to look at it more in a modern light. So modern cultural diffusion, the key here is that cultural ideas, practices, and innovations change and disappear over time. And that's because they're socially constructed. That's how culture is. And they're affected by both small and large scale processes. And I'm going to get into that in a second. Some of the large scale processes that they're affected by are things like globalization and urbanization. And we can see this present in media and technology and politics, economics, and social relationships. Also, we want to remember that as places become more economically developed and people get more disposable income, they're also going to change their cultural preferences just by having more money. And there are differences in cultural diffusion at different scales. So if we're looking at it globally versus nationally or locally, we might see a different way that that thing is spreading, and that's important. So let's look at some examples. This first one will be a very cool graphic that's going to show you how over time, technology, globalization, urbanization can just change the landscape of a place. So as we urbanize, roads are built, buildings are built, this all makes sense. So in India, there's a lot of great things you can see. For example, if we look at toponyms, a lot of places in India have changed the name. So if we look at Mumbai, this is a picture from Mumbai that I'll explain in 1 second. The original name of Mumbai was Bombay. This changed in the 90s because the leaders of the area felt that it was a legacy of British colonization. So they purposely changed it to Mumbai to honor a Hindu goddess and in order to try to get that history out of the name, right? So this photo also is called the Gateway of India, and it was built to honor a British king, but you can see that it's also got traditional Marathi architecture. So you can see this mixture of old and new and historical and contemporary. This is an example of a small scale process affecting diffusion because that local leader decided to change the name. Whereas if we look at English being spoken in India, that's kind of a bigger process going on. So English is taught in schools there. It's also in a lot of Bollywood movies that they'll just throw in a phrase of English. A lot of people know English in India. Why is English spoken there? If we look back to colonization, this of course makes sense. The British colonized the area. English has spread to the whole South Asia region. But it's also continued with globalization because English is a lingua franca, and a lot of places around the world use English for trade, business, and just social media, entertainment, etc. So that's more an example of a large scale process. So almost every place has both large and small scale processes going on that spread these modern cultural diffusion. Another great example that's a fun one is South Korea and K-pop. So K-pop became more of a global cultural phenomenon because of globalization. If we look at it at different scales and different economic developments, we might see a little bit of a different picture. If you went to any small town in South Korea, they've probably heard of K-pop just because it started in their country. If you went to a small rural town in Ecuador, most likely they will have not heard of it. But it's also spread because of globalization. So we've got this mixture of looking at things at different scales and things also spreading at a larger process of globalization. For example, this picture on the right is a K-pop concert that's happening in St. Petersburg, Russia. So that's an example of globalization right there. So what should we take away from all of this? Globalization and urbanization are among the large-scale processes that contribute to modern cultural diffusion all over the globe. You can always see this in a lot of different ways, in media, technology, politics, economics, and social relationships. Another key thing is to keep in mind what Mr. Hill said from 3.5, because historical and contemporary diffusion are completely intertwined. It's very hard to separate what's historical and what's modern. So that's a key thing to remember. And also remember scale matters. If we're looking at it locally, versus globally, you're going to see a different spread and maybe for different reasons. So next video, we'll more specifically look at how improving communication technologies and the time-space convergence contribute to the spread and changing of cultural practices. As always, go out and find the good in the world. Hello and welcome back. I'm Ms. Patel, teaching you about topic 3.6, contemporary causes of diffusion. So today we're going to talk more about the communication technologies that help spread things. So there's communication technologies such as the internet and time-space convergence that help to reshape and accelerate interactions among people. They change cultural practices. Specifically, we're going to talk today about how English is spreading, and also that's making us lose indigenous languages as people keep speaking English. And it creates cultural convergence and divergence. So let's break some of this down a little bit more. First, we need to remind ourselves what the time-space convergence is. So this is the idea that people are getting closer together because of improvements in technology that make both transportation and communication easier. So it's physically easier to get all over the world, but it's also easier to communicate on the internet, look up a different culture. So it's making us all closer together. The other thing to distinguish here is the difference between cultural divergence and cultural convergence. So cultural divergence is when people may start slowly leaving their culture or certain elements of it, such as maybe an immigrant to a certain country starting to eat pizza instead of their traditional food, but they're not leaving the whole culture. Cultural convergence is when everybody starts doing this massive global culture, making us lose a lot of these unique cultures, and that's why we care about it. So let's look at an example. The English language is a very important one to know, and I'm going to show you in a second how it shows up in a lot of FRQs as well. So English is prominent on the internet. It's also a very big language in trade and business, and scale matters here too, because if we think back to the lingua franca part of English, that it's a global lingua franca, that's very true, but there are certain areas where a different language on a smaller scale might be more common. But the key here is English is the globalized language. This is the one most people speak to do trade and business on a global scale. It's also big in the entertainment world, right? A lot of the Hollywood movies, Netflix are in English. And it's what you see the most on social media. There's also a large number of English-speaking tourists that have enough money to travel all over the world. So all of these things together make English a very fast spreading prominent language that a lot of people speak. And the reason we care about it is that a lot of traditional languages are being lost as those groups of people decide they want to continue learning English because it helps with all these things, and it's also just all over the place right now. So let's practice with an FRQ because this shows up a lot. Again, you can always pause your video to read the whole thing through, but we're just going to look at part B right now because this focuses on what we are looking at. So it asks you to identify and discuss 2 reasons for the current rate of diffusion of English as a lingua franca, which is pretty much what we just did. Acceptable answers on the rubric are listed on the slide. So for example, if we picked mass media, we could explain that English is predominantly the language in most media outlets, news, social media, etc. Another example of an FRQ, and I'm showing you 2 of these because this is showing you how often this shows up. This is a very important example to know. Let's just focus on part C for this one. Again, you can pause to read the whole thing if you would like. For part C, it asks you to explain 2 examples to show how globalization is contributing to English becoming the world's lingua franca. So very similar to the last one. And these would be all the acceptable answers, very similar. So for example, if we chose business as our answer, you obviously would have to explain it more. So you might say something like, globalization has caused English to be the main language of trade and business, and therefore it's valuable for a lot of different countries and a lot of different people to learn it in order to participate in the global economy. So what should we take away? We're getting closer and closer together. That's the key. And these communication technologies, such as the internet, social media, time-space convergence, they're all changing the way we interact with each other. So that's the key. So it also changes cultural practices in the process, and it also creates cultural convergence and divergence. The key thing here is there's a battle going on between globalization and local unique cultures. And if we don't realize that as people in the world, we are going to lose a lot of unique cultures and languages, religions, and that's what we need to focus on. So yes, we can take globalization and make it mix with these traditional cultures to hopefully maintain those cultures. Next video, you will go on a journey with Mr. Hill all over the world to learn about different religions, ethnicities, and languages. As always, go out and find the good in the world, and thank you.